Just going to hit record. And I'm taking point for David today. He is out. So anything I do wrong is because I'm new to this. There's the HackMD for today's notes. Please pop your name in there. If you're a VMware, just stick yourself on the same line as me. And if someone could take notes, that'd be great. Someone up to taking notes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Give that a whirl.
Groovy. And then I will share my screen for now, just to look at these things. So at the moment, the only outstanding RFC, the only thing that's looks like it's ready to move that I could see was the introduce Kate's events, which is simply sitting in a final comment period, and we have not seen anything since. So I suspect we can call that accepted, unless anyone has any last minute concerns. So many comments. Nope, that's it. So assuming that's all good, I will move that on now. If I can remember how to. Here we go. Not able to move it there for some reason. Where is it? To accepted. There we go. Great. Has anyone got any RFCs they'd like to bring up today? No, this was the new format. Whoever's editing that. The new format was just to talk about them, not worry about the new statuses too much. But I'm happy to call it happy to just call it now accepted. So anyone else, anything else currently pressing? We're heading towards a sprint to try and deliver our 0.0.4 milestone. So I think that's why there's no new RFCs at the moment. If nothing, then questions and discussion topics. Has anyone got anything on their mind they'd like to talk about? Seeing as we've got a bit of time, you know, throw it out there. Feedback from most recent KubeCon, anything like that?
We can give a bit of feedback. I think Cartographer came up a number of times. There was a talk of it, and including the talk, and very, very well attended. So I think there's a good amount of understanding and interest in it. There was a few discussions we had as well. I think also met Scott as well, who's on the call, which was quite nice. So I think one of the things that really jumped out, I think, was I think the other projects that are doing building on top of Kubernetes. I think when I was going around some of the areas and talking with them and understanding, having a little bit of a look at what they're doing, I think there's similar challenges around complexity and things. I really think I love what the work that we're doing, the focus, what we have around the feedback we've already had, and what we're doing to address those things like the blueprint RFC and other things like that, and the other surfacing areas and stuff like that. That was really just one of my takeaways. So definitely super interesting. Supply chains is a very hot topic at the moment, understandably. And then I guess how we're looking at doing some collaboration and integrations with some of these other open source projects would be really good as well.
Great.
think, I guess to preview something, a conversation that Scott and I had was around once you build, you're going to push some K8s configuration to a repo, and that question of, are you pushing it to one repo, and then you pull from that one repo to a number of different environments that they all, or do you say, or do you expect the person who's writing the supply chain, has knowledge of and has control over how many different types of environments that can be pushed to? Because right now, if you push to just one repo and you expect, like, oh yeah, the people, like the deliverables, the deploys on the other end of things that are going to pull that that configuration, there may be changes that they need to make to right size them for the cluster that they're using. And so, Scott and I were talking about, oh yeah, what would it look like to change that in flight once you've grabbed it with your deliverable in delivery. That sounded, it sounded like a use case that is reasonable enough that we might want an answer to it. So, and yeah, I think Scott had already been thinking about it and was like, yeah, you could just, if we just allowed you to specify with a JSON path to say, like, oh yeah, at this value, replace it with this, somewhat similar to, similar to what YTT does, but in our own Carto way.
I've been thinking about this a bunch. Yeah, and I think it's not just a question of, like, do we need some ability to modify one Git repo that's created right from the build cluster dynamically as it gets installed into the next cluster, deployed into the next cluster via an overlay or values or whatever. I think it's actually, we kind of need two Git repos, or at least two Git repos. There's like the output of the build cluster, that's something that you want to promote through different environments, right? Like it's some Kubernetes configuration that should apply in different places. But then each of those environments, in many cases, could have a Git repo that's specific to that environment that has other deployments in it as well, right? And so I put together this, like, kind of, if you don't mind, if I could pick up the screen share from whoever. Yeah. So I put together this diagram just last week because I was thinking about the same thing. It's just like, what is the, like, how can I maximize this problem into every possible combination of things, or like make this like draw a really generic version of what the interaction between the, kind of thing running on your build cluster and thing running on your production cluster would look like. I don't know if this kind of framing helps a little bit, but like there's this, like, maybe a producer that's like on a build cluster supply chain, right? That's, either producing templates in a Git repo, or maybe in the future, Helm charts or packages, right? Could be the output of that, build cluster. And this is like templatized configuration. Right now, we don't templatize it, but it really, like, I think we're like, you could put overlays over it when you deploy it, which is kind of what you were talking about. You could do dynamically in the other environment, right? But then there's maybe this middle step that we're not talking about, that's like interpolate whatever this is and commit it to an environment specific Git repo, and then pick up that environment specific Git repo and deploy it. And like, maybe even these are separate Git repos. Like, this would have to be a fork of that. James pointed that out, so that'd be a little weird. But like, this, to me, there's like kind of three places in Git where this could exist. There's where the templates are, there's whoever's making the requesting PR, and there's whoever like is receiving the PR into the environment specific Git repo before it gets deployed. And like, I think in many cases, these could be alighted out. Like in the example you presented, I think that's perfectly valid configuration to say you could just apply an overlay immediately and not have an environment specific copy. But I think if you completely expand the problem out to make it as generic as possible, there's a lot of different pieces that someone could configure to make to interact with it. Sorry, Rash.
Yeah, one of the things that I think this solves for that people are bringing up fairly regularly, internal customers at VMware, but also others, have talked about, can we use this for delivery, not for deployment? So can we have packages at the end of our chain? And packages need to be configurable, right? So that first step definitely rings true. And if we can incorporate that at all times, that would be like in all of our demonstrations and likely scenarios for supply chains, that might be more appreciable that way.
I think a really interesting part of that is it makes it clear that actually you're not promoting this, right? You're not like promoting what gets deployed into the environment. You're promoting the thing that happens before interpolation, before it gets deployed into the environment. So somehow, as we're thinking about supply chains, right, and the examples we provide in the repo and things like that, right, figuring out a way to make it so it's easy to like take a cat package and interpolate that and make that the thing gets deployed, but then have the delivery actually promote the package forward, not the commit that got put into the environment specific repo, right? So that packaging story, I think it may be better for us to think about packaging as the primary way, and then look at templates in a Git repo as a form of package, if that makes sense.
I also think that there's at that point where, for certain consumers anyway, when they've placed on an intermediate cluster, that configuration should be copied forward, because they want their smoke test to have run on a given known configuration before promoting that forward, and that will still need to be kept in mind when designing supply chains and deliveries like this. They really want to know it was a tested configuration, not one of many possibilities.
Which is why I wonder how much we want to open up the ability of customization, meaning there are things that definitely you want to be able to configure, right? Like the resource limits and requests that would get deployed is a very common thing that you are going to change between dev, QA, and prod. That is something that usually your dev cluster isn't going to be the same. But changing the image mapped within the deployment is something that probably shouldn't be changed, because if you do, what help did it do that you did dev and QA before going to prod? That's where I think, on one hand, having it, you could already do this through Git and having multiple Git writers and push to multiple places and having AppCR that would pull in from multi-Git fetches and whatever and do something in that sort. I wonder if it's worth it. I mean, with Shimon, we're talking about adding almost a descriptive way within the deliverable CRD for like adding resources, right? Even if it wasn't for everything, but just for the things that we know are the common things that someone would want to change. For anything else, you can use the full Git path and, updates and merging different repos and all of that. But for the common case, maybe giving that simple overlay mechanism of whether it's a JSON patch, if not using YTT, or a YTT overlay, would give a more, let's say, safe default that someone wouldn't start messing with things.
I hear you suggest two things there. Like, it sounds like one, but I think it's two, which is that deliverables have a shape for very common configurable elements. And then the implementation in the templates is to use something like JSON path to apply that as a mutation, some templating further on in the delivery, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
right, because that way it's also very declarative what I want to change. If I am doing the kubectl apply of my deliverable, or my Argo app that I created is doing the whatever, or however I'm getting that deliverable in, I have told it exactly what I want those changes to be based off of the upstream, instead of it kind of happening with Git magic in the back end, where troubleshooting that gets very interesting down the road to figure out what was actually changed and where the source of every field from which of the 3 Git repos I'm merging together is actually coming from.
So I've got some thoughts around this. I think there's, just taking a step back slightly, I think where we want to be able to support different packaging. You know, some folks are going to be using Helm, some folks are going to use the cat controller applications, and some will just do vanilla Kubernetes resources. We want to encourage good GitOps practices as well. I think everything in it should be in a Git repository apart from secrets. That's something I really strongly believe in. Configuration as code is a standard software in the software industry. People really expect that. So everything apart from secrets, but you could have secret references like the external secrets or the CSI driver stuff. So, but one of the things I think is, sorry, just bear with me a second, Rash. One of the things I think is important is how we define that structure of a GitOps repo, because we want to be able to build automation over the top of these Git repos. I think folks are also, when we did this in Jenkins X, we started off with lots of different Git repos, and we got the feedback of actually most people only want a Git repo per cluster. And then you have your application operator it has permissions, and we have a configuration file in there. So that's environment specific configuration for that cluster, which we then templatize and commit it back into the Git repo. I can show people anytime they want to have a look at what's gone on. But it worked really well, and then people like the permission model that way, because any change that goes into my cluster that I own as a platform operator, I set notes. People can pull requests into it, but nobody has permissions to be able to merge those changes, and therefore you've got a nice clean quality gates changes, an approval mechanism of changes coming into your cluster that you own and that you can configure yourself and then push out when you want to promote out. Just some thoughts. Sorry, Rash.
Yeah, I mean, you triggered something that I've been thinking about, so I'll ask for the screen back again, Stephen. And this is just some thoughts that I was having, and I've shared with quite a lot of technical leadership. That there's quite a. I believe that some sort of canonical record it's the workload, and in the case of what we're talking about with configuring deployments is very close to a canonical representation of expected state or desired state. And without going into too much depth here, believe that we could end up with an actually canonical revision, something that includes, hard references. When it comes to a workload, it would be the source. When it comes to a deployment, it would be the specific ref in your GitOps repo. Your deliverable. I'll get the words right. And that should be something, and it is something that is quite easy to add to what's written to our GitOps repo, that canonical reference, right? So I think in line with that, we will be able to take that canonical reference of what went through a supply chain or a delivery to end up with what we have deployed. I'm not sure that it'd take the shape, but it's sort of emerging to me that we can definitely do that. And then the only thing that isn't hard pinned is the shape of the deliverable or the delivery, the deliverable or the supply chain, the shape of the blueprint. Not sure how to tackle that, but it is important that they exist as being able to deliver, especially in the supply chain, being able to deliver that live patching behavior. So something to consider there, but definitely taking the workload or the deliverable into your GitOps repo and using that as the way that you can then apply it back to a cluster to keep on building a known good scenario or a known good bundle is an approach I think might work for what you're talking about, James. I think it sounds similar to what's going on in Jenkins X.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, just very quickly, I could actually probably I'll share my screen seeing as we're doing a show and tell. There we go. Let's do something like this. This is one of the repo. This is a repo that gets created. So a lot of this you can kind of ignore, but in here you've got the JX requirements, which is the environment, the cluster specific configuration that we have. Here we got some information. I mean, this is a typical one, right? Each cluster you're going to want to pass in a domain of something. So that's a good one. Each cluster in each environment is going to have something different. So this is kind of like this, and we then have we defaulted to using Helm and then Helm file. Helm file is a way to construct multiple Helm charts. So if you go into here, each one of these folders represents a namespace. You can imagine this one's maybe Cert Manager is a different one. So the Helm files, what you would do is you can have in multiple charts in here, so multiple charts, and you can actually then add in the template, the global configuration for your environment configuration, which is here, which was basically generated from a job, and then any custom configuration. And of course, you can then add in extra configuration into from a different folder within that Git repository if you wanted to. But what would actually happen is, and this is the interesting bit, because we followed the approach for Google's Config Connect, I think it is the project. What we do is the job would be running inside the cluster. It would actually template this and push out the generated configuration. So if we go into config root, all of this is generated. And in here, if we go to, let's go namespaces, I don't know, JX, here we go. Let's do Nexus. And so what you'd actually see in here is the real, to generate any custom configuration, it would actually be the exact configuration that is applied, is effectively kubectl applied inside the cluster. And what that means is you've got this kind of really nice, if I look at the commit, you can always see every single time what configuration is going in. And any state change for that cluster is exactly in that config root directory. And which was just really, it worked really, really well. So I guess where I'm kind of going to show, I think you're right, Rash, right? I think there's something here, there's some meld of some things we've learned. Having that global or configuration that we want to be able to provide in a Git repository is a good thing. And then maybe supporting different ways people applying, maybe using Argo or Flux or Cat Controller or kubectl and applying a job. But providing this kind of mechanism per cluster seems to be quite a nice way. I don't know if anybody's, but that's kind of what it is. Yeah, this is how we kind of did it.
So a big difference being there that the final implementation, finally what's going to be deployed is actually stored in GitOps as well.
Exactly. Yeah. It's actually, so it's all templated. And I seem to remember something from Joe Beda actually once mentioned something similar to around this, called about expansion or something like that. It was. I have to dig out where it was, but I think it was a nice approach. And yeah, they do that in Google's in Config Connect version of this as well. And it is quite nice because then you've got, that is the desired state. And granted, you never really go into this config root directory, only when there's something wrong and you want to have traceability to find out what happened and what went wrong. And then you can actually pull that out to a pull request and either revert it or, your traceability of where things are tracking down changes going into your cluster.
Just before I hand it over to you, Washima, we're nearly at time. We'll just get Washima's last comment here, and then I'll just ask if there's anything else. So, Washima?
My comment is a question for Stephen. Because new ideas. I want to question and make sure I'm building the right mental model. Would you say that the output of that second cluster would be very similar to what James just showed us, or do you think of those as like really different?
I think the thing I showed was intended to be abstract enough to encompass the model that James is describing, if that makes sense. So the same, but I was trying not to, because I think different customers are going to have different kinds of different end users of Cartographer, right, are going to have different kinds of configuration mechanisms and ways that they want to do promotion, right? I can imagine one Git repo being used for everything, but things getting committed back to that Git repo, right? I could imagine all the interpolation happening at one stage ahead of time in the commit of the templatized thing and the interpolated configuration, that getting promoted all the way through. But I think in the end, there's always these stages of like, you're producing templatized configuration, you're interpolating it, you're potentially getting it back into a Git repo that's environment specific, right? And you're deploying that into an environment, and then you're signifying that the original thing needs to get reinterpolated for the next environment and deployed. Maybe that gets committed back to Git, maybe it doesn't, right? And so I think it'd be great if we ensure that we're, from Cartographer's perspective, right, the Cartographer is compatible with all of those different kinds of workflows, right? And that, like, there are tools available to do that.
Yeah, and because there's also kind of the customized model, which is one app per repo just with overlays by folder of environment. Instead of doing a repo per environment, doing a repo per app with folders for overlays,
Yeah,
which is something else that you see at a lot of places.
We're going to have to call it there, but it's a really interesting discussion. Keep it going in the open source channel, keep it going in your back channels, and let's make sure that we come back to it, because I think this is a good future, the discussion of the future of Cartographer. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Hey, Trash.